Hi guys, John here, also called Snoopy, and today we have a special guest, Tom from Shut Up Sit Down. Hi Tom.
Hello, how's it going? How you doing?
Pretty good. So I've noticed you've been a really big fan of arcs, and I thought it'd be fun to have a conversation. So maybe just start by introducing yourself and just kind of what your experience has been with arcs so far.
Cool. I'm Tom. I work for Shut Up and Sit Down. We're a board game review show, and we recently put out two, not one, but two, giant video reviews of arcs. One going over the base game, one going over the campaign. There's also a secret third video that I'm
Ooh,
doing for Patreon subscribers. It's a little decadent. It's a little silly, but I feel like it's the kind of game that deserves that kind of treatment. So yeah, that's kind of what I've been for the past few months. I've been the ARCs guy for Shut Up and Sit Down. So,
nice.
yeah, happy to talk some more about it here.
Okay. Um, so one of the big points in your review, which I know a lot of people were talking about, was how you made the case that Arcs is a timeless classic, or it's a lasting game compared to a lot of other games coming out these days. So, what are some elements that you would point to? It's like, see, look at this, and this is how I know Arcs is a lasting classic game.
Sure. I mean, I make this sort of point very early in the review, but I'm sort of 40 plays into arcs now. Well, I'm over 40 plays into it because I thought I would maybe slow down on playing it after putting out the review, but everyone keeps being like Arcs Night question mark, and I'm like, yeah, let's go
Right.
again. But the thing is that even like 40 plays in. Or 40 plus plays in, I'm still finding it like a kind of a complete head scratcher in a lot of ways. It is such a sort of strange hybrid mix of design, that like sort of area control game, the sort of space game of it all merged with the trick taking, means that I've never really felt entirely like comfortable with it as a design in a weird way. I've never felt like it's a game that feels like procedural. It always feels like it develops in a very strange way each time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that's definitely like that's even more true of the campaign game where I've not played it as much as I have just base arcs at this point, but the fact that the ways that the different fates kind of branch into each other and will sort of change and react depending on how well they're doing in the game, but also how well everyone around them is doing and what other fates might be present and all that kind of stuff. It's just such a like rich kind of puzzle that doesn't ever become kind of like rote or stayed throughout all of those plays. Like I sort of normally, people will ask the channel broadly, how do you know when you've like played enough of a game
Right.
and that then it's time to review it? When is enough? And me and Matt always say, like there is a time when it'll just click, and sometimes that's like really early on. Sometimes that's like you've played 3 games of something and you're like, I this is great, I need to make a review. And sometimes you'll just keep playing it over and over and you'll be like, what, I'm trying to figure this out this whole time.
Right.
And Arcs has a little lick of that in it. It has that kind of constant like, you want to just play it, just one more time, just to dig at something that you kind of felt like you were getting right that last time. I guess that's something to do with the fact that the game is so layered as well.
Sure.
Because I think that when I've been playing it, like when you first show it to people, they want action efficiency. They want to like really juice their hand for like all of the pips within it. That's all they're focused on. And then you're like, okay, well, do that, sure. But then how do you factor that with doing the right actions at the right time? Like, how do you set up and pay off effectively? And then how do you then layer that with the right ambitions? How do you time that correctly with the table so that people can't like steal an ambition away from you?
Right.
How do you then negotiate that with your fellow players around the table? There's just so many different
Yeah.
kind of tiers of understanding.
Yeah.
That yeah, it makes it very, very rich. I guess
Mm-hmm.
that's the main thing that makes it lasting for me, sure.
Yeah, maybe elaborate more on you talk about how it can proceed very differently from game to game. So, for example, a game like Eclipse or even a
Mhm.
game like Scythe from Stonemaier Games, you have a set opening. Okay, you do this stuff, and you can have a couple of options, but generally, here's what you should do to kind of get your engine rolling or get the exploration part of the game or get this technology system set up.
Mhm, mhm.
Where exactly does Arcs kind of go deviant and do different things than that?
Yeah, I guess there's a lot of like texture in the way that if we take leaders and law as we're including leaders and law in this. when you sort of start a game, even within the draft, you're looking at not only, what leaders are available, but also what lore cards are available, also what planets you're going to start on, what resources you have access to, and how you're going to combo those things together. And looking at a sort of starting position of the board, looking at even the kind of like the small decision of what is the first card played, the game can evolve so differently and so quickly from that starting point. Like you can have a game where turn one, chapter one, turn one, someone plays, a 4 of aggression, declares warlord, and we're off to the races.
Right.
And that you're playing a very different game immediately from turn one than if someone, plays, the 2 of construction and lets everyone just spend a little bit of time building up their board presence.
Yep.
Like these little tiny decisions kind of build up into a game that feels very reactive. I think that's the biggest sort of point of it, is that like, because you don't know what ambitions you're swinging for from round to round, it is a game that rewards that flexibility. And so you can't just say, I am playing this role. This is exactly what I'm going to do on turn one every single time I play, because there's too much to think about for you to do that. That's
Right.
crazy.
Yeah.
I really liked because Charlie Thiel, who's a games writer who I adore, did a fantastic review of Base Game Arcs, but he talked about sort of all of those layers and all that understanding as requiring a sort of Paul Atreides
Mm,
level of like foresight and understanding.
right.
And I think that that's definitely something, is that a player who can, say that they've got it all mapped out from turn one is probably wrong.
Sure.
It's too much to consider for you to just launch into a sort of grand strategy from the get-go, for sure.
Mm.
Um,
Yeah, I think that is true. Like there is the court dynamic where you have
mm,
this politicking, maneuvering, negotiating part. And so that could be how you are influencing the game is I'm going to get these very powerful lore cards or guild cards and
mm,
box cards. Or I'm just going to be board present. So I'm going to get a bunch of ships, get a bunch of starports, be very flexible with my fleets. Or I'm just going to go for other people's cities and start getting captives and maybe even trophies and
yeah.
try to manipulate those things. Or you could just go for resources. So there's so many different avenues you can go, but unlike other games, they're all interconnected. There's no like corner
Mm.
you can hide in. Um,
Yes. Yes, that's
so
very true.
so I think the only exception is captives are very hard to get, and so if you get a massive
Mm.
lead in that, um, that can be hard. But even then, like the table can kind of coordinate and try to mess you over if they don't have it ever declared, you know.
Yes.
Um, so yeah, I think for me when I think about arcs, why I would argue it's a classic is just the systems we've seen before, but the way they blend and mesh is very unique, and the
Yes.
the sum is greater than its parts.
Yeah,
Um,
I think I wish I'd have spent longer talking about the way in the review that like it's just so alien having a whole sort of like dense trick taking puzzle put on top of the sort of the space game that you might sort of like recognize.
mhm,
That blend where the two things meet is where that sort of magic is, in terms of making it something that's very like unique and alien when you sit down to it for the first time, but also so rewarding that you can't necessarily apply knowledge from other games into arcs. Like sure you can a bit, but
sure,
it presents such a unique puzzle that it's very hard to just kind of go into it with a solid game plan that you're going to execute on 100% of the time. And just touching on when you were saying about what, gathering guild cards and things like that, I played a game as Corsair recently, whose whole thing is, being a little bit better at raiding, but also not being very, you have to collect lots of skirmish dice as well. That's their downside. And I was like praying for skirmishers to come out of that guild deck as soon as it possibly could. And my game, I just, because it came out on like turn two, and I was like, yes, amazing, and I capitalized on it and ran with that for the rest of the game. But my game as Corsair would be so different if I had to wait like until deep into the game to be like, because that's the strategy layer, right? As Corsair, I'm looking at getting these kinds of cards, building up this kind of position, but you just can't bank on any of that happening, and you have to play reactively. And in another game that I played as Corsair, I tried to do that, and all my nice cards never came up. But because I
right,
was doggedly chasing the strategic angle rather than just playing the game that was in front of me, I got completely dumpstered. And I
right,
think that's a real breath of fresh air.
yeah.
Yeah,
No, I agree. So obviously, arcs isn't for everybody. There's been
that's
some
true.
some common criticisms with arcs, Is there any that come to mind that you kind of want to touch on or want to talk to me about? Just some things that you've been seeing or hearing, even from your own play groups.
I think the biggest one that I sort of find the most interesting is people talking about it being a random game, and I think that is definitely true of your first few games. That there is a lot of like randomness baked into arcs, and that can be very off-putting initially, especially I think in the race for getting initiative. You can feel
Hmm.
very powerless if you know you're just dealt bad hands in the sense that you can't claim initiative with them
Right.
reliably, and you end up in these sort of games which you just feel like you're at the whims of your hand and that's it. But then I think that you realize the more that you play, you realize two things. You firstly realize that mitigation is a huge part of the game, and being able to twist whatever hand you're being dealt into something that's gonna like really sing for you. That's obviously part number one. But I think the second thing is I think it requires you looking at the game in a slightly different light. And I think that Arcs comes with a lot of sort of space game baggage.
Sure.
People look at it and they think this is a game that's going to play like Eclipse, like TI, like any other number of blow up your friends in space games, but it's very different. And those games are kind of defined by relatively low randomness, by these games that the randomness comes from the players being these sort of active agents in the story rather than like the actual systems themselves. Though, of course, TI has big dice rolls, but it's beside the point. But I think that for me, it came with this realization of looking at Arcs as a playful game. And to kind of like expand on that, if you were to, it would be ridiculous to accuse Cockroach Poker of being too random, or like Liar's Dice of being too
Sure.
random. The games want to be random, so using it as a derisive quality like doesn't really make much sense in context. And so I guess to me, it's about looking at what Arcs wants to be,
Hmm.
like, and I think that what it wants to be is playful, right?
Right.
Like, and I think that you're not going into games like Game of Thrones, for example. You're not going into that game trying to expecting to find playfulness. You're
Sure.
going into it expecting to find like cold, calculated combat. And I think a lot of people look at the quite abstract board of Arcs and go, "This is going to be, razor sharp and
Right.
severe." And
Right.
then they roll a bunch of raid dice and they get no keys, and they're like, "Dodoi," you know.
Yeah.
I thought I was playing a different game, but really I'm playing something that is like a little bit silly on its
Yeah.
edges. Um, and because I think that like when people look at Cole's work for leader games, especially Root, Oath, and Arcs are all very playful, like at
Right.
their core. They are like a little sillier, they've got this sort of like slightly daft edge to them, whereas his sort of whirligig work has a lot less of that. You wouldn't really accuse like Pax Pamir of being a playful game, right?
No.
Like
No.
it is sharp and savage. And on the back of the box for Arcs, it says it's like the game takes place in a dark yet silly universe. And I
Hmm.
think that's such a good way of looking at the game as a whole. Like
Right.
there is this immense skill ceiling and incredible amounts of like depth in the systems. But at the end of the day, like you're gonna laugh at a really daft dice roll at some point. Like you're gonna get into a petty squabble over trophies that'll define your entire chapter 3 or whatever.
Hmm.
Um, and so when people say it's too random, I think that that's sort of it's a more of a perspective thing to me. It's
Sure.
like if you can shift your perspective to be like, this is a game that is screaming at you. We've got boatloads of dice rolls. Of course, it's going to be a little random.
Yeah.
I think you get much more out of it then.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. I agree. I think it is funny hearing Cole now that the game's out talking about it. He's a couple of times compared it to almost like poker, and like
sure.
this element of, yes, there's cold hard statistics in poker, but there's also this element of just chance and randomness.
Hmm. Hmm.
So I think taking that as an inspiration for arcs is helpful for people who are like, what is this game? Like, I hear it's random. Like, what kind of randoms you're talking about? It's really similar to poker. Like
Sure.
like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
you could get dealt bad hands, but unlike poker, you have tools and resources to get out of that through the
Hmm.
resources and guild cards, even board positions at table talking. That in poker, if you're dealt a bad hand, I mean, you can try to bluff, but that's all you got.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
and so at least with arcs, like it's a similar but better experience than just like Texas Hold'em. Um,
Yeah.
So
We've had lots of games that have come down to that poker like as well. What are they holding being such a huge question for the table? Like you're looking at this card like, you know, when you have a sort of like reasonably a card that's like high but it isn't a 6 or a 7, and you're like, am I going to be able to like surpass with this and like successfully get the initiative or not? And then that's where it like really kind of gets into the drama of it, and the sort of the fun of the game. It is so playful. It is such a fun game because it's full of these moments of like tension around dice rolls and like gritting your teeth because you're really like hoping someone doesn't have a particular card at a particular time. And that's the stuff that I think sets it apart for me, is that it is like this game that has, you know, this yeah, again, like a big skill ceiling, but it has these big moments that let, you know, people kind of find fun within it rather than just being like, I'm dead and I'm out the game forever.
right,
um I actually, so if we still want to talk about like sort of common complaints and stuff,
yeah,
I think I've seen a lot of people say that it's too mean.
yeah,
Um, like out there, a lot of people saying it's really mean, and it's weird to me because I agree with, like, I think that was one of the big criticisms of the review, is that I didn't talk about it being zero sum and
sure,
mean and nasty enough, and I can agree with that. I do think it's true that like it is a meaner game than I would suggest in that video. But it's interesting to me because I never perceived it as being like what I would traditionally call like mean.
sure,
Um, because I think it is so abstract and there's so much sort of like it's so visible what everyone wants at any given time, that when someone has all the, you know, materials and tycoon's been declared, there's no hard feelings when you go over and try and take them away from them, because like of course you're going to do that. And to me,
sure.
like a mean game is mean when it has an element of like betrayal, or it has an
Mm,
element of kind of like cruelty or sort of
sure,
decimation in it. But like
sure,
all out conflict in arcs doesn't necessarily reward you as much as like, you know, getting in there and stealing a critical thing and then leaving. Unless
sure.
obviously you're playing a big warlord game or something like that. But
No,
it never feels personal, is I guess the argument that I would say for arcs.
sure,
It always feels kind of like it's inevitable. And it feels a little slapstick when it does happen.
sure.
Especially because those dice can go so well and so badly
Yeah.
at any given time.
No, I agree. I will say though, arcs can be cruel in that if you make a
Mm,
mistake, you can get punished. So
yes.
one example is, you know, you have a bigger fleet, you go spend the ship somewhere to try to raid somebody, and the fight goes poorly, or maybe it's fine, but then someone else comes in and they sit on your starport, and you don't have another starport, and now
Yeah.
you got to get your ships back. But what if your ships are destroyed? Now they're just sitting on your cities, taxing you, losing your agents one by one, and there's nothing you can do about it unless someone else comes in to help you.
Yeah.
Or you know, warlords never declared, so you slowly run out of ships, and they sit in trophy boxes, and now there's nothing you can do in chapter 4 because you don't have any more
Mhm.
ships. So it can be cruel in that the choices you make can make you helpless, but they're choices you make, not necessarily
Yes.
choices other people are making for you.
And I also think like letting a sort of, if you're in a four-player game and someone is kind of getting away with that, like if you've been completely conquered and then someone's just sitting on your stuff and taxing you endlessly and really profiting from it, the other players need to react to that. And I think that's where the sort of self-balancing aspect of the game, which is true of I think all of like Cole's games with Leader especially,
Right.
comes in, that sort of aspect comes into play of other people trying to get you out of that situation, because it doesn't benefit them having someone, you know, around the table getting infinite access to captives. I think that's like, as we've sort of got better at the game, the more we've realized that it is a game about like other players policing each other and making sure that you sort of, you know, check power correctly.
Yes.
But that obviously that in a two-player game, you could get into these really nasty zones where someone is just like absolutely monstering you,
Sure.
and there's little you can do about it sometimes. So yeah, I
Sure.
will concede to it being occasionally a pretty cruel game.
Sure.
Uh,
But it doesn't have to be that way. And I think, like you mentioned, like the skill ceiling, like as you get better at the game, understand the systems and the resources and what you actually do have within your control, a lot of
yeah.
that does fade, and you realize that you have much more agency than when you first played the game.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. No, for sure. Like that gulf in. I think that because you go into it, it's all about perceptions. I think with arcs. because you go into it expecting the big space game, you will often not play the trick-taking game particularly well in your first few games of it.
Right.
And then as you start understanding how integral that is and how integral playing that side of things is into the experience, you become miles better at the game, I think.
No,
Just
yeah.
being able to like briefly, like just having those mental notes of like where certain cards are is just so helpful.
Yep.
And when people hit that, then they're off to the races.
Yeah, knowing when to seize because you have the last three admin cards
Oh,
it is key. Like it is really powerful if you know these cards are the only ones left, and someone else is gonna have to
yeah.
seize if they want it, and they probably won't because they don't think I surely he doesn't have all three of them. Well, so it
That's funny.
yeah.
Going back to the poker analogy as well, like
Mm-hmm.
my housemate Luke, who I've played almost all of my games of Arcs with, now can tell when I'm gonna do that. Like he like we literally had it in the most recent game where he'd spent multiple turns just hitting me over and over and over again to try and get Warlord, loads of trophies of Warlord. And then the next round, I had like 4 aggression cards or something, and it was like turn 2, I seize, and then I play the 5 of aggression, and he seizes right back because he's like, "No, you're not taking me here. We're not going into this horrible aggression zone." And
Right.
I was upset, but he could just tell
Mm-hmm.
and that's the where the bluffing element comes in, where the card game of it all is
Right.
kind of rooted, I think.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a good game. They made a good one.
let's talk about one other criticism, and this one I think I mentioned to you pretty early on when we started
Hmm.
talking about the game was Sea Fates. So this came out shortly after the game was finished, and playtesters were talking about their thoughts now that the game was done, and there was some concerns with some playtesters um, that the Sea Fates didn't quite work in that either
Mm.
they're too easy or that it kind of thwarted the purpose of the game. And now that the game's out, I've seen similar feedback from some players where yeah, the Sea Fates almost undermine what Campaign Arcs is doing. And so,
Mm.
what would you say to that feedback or that idea?
I definitely had a moment of kind of feeling that way about the Sea Fates when in an early campaign when we were sort of getting our bearings, we ended up with a game where I think we had like 3 Sea Fates in play, and it just felt like crazy. It just really felt like you were trying to put out everyone's fires at once. And the one A Fate that was still in the game just gave up. They
Right.
were like, "There's no way I'm ever going to win." But I think the more you play, I think there's two things. The more you play, the more you. Oh, excuse me. Oh no. um the more you play, the more you realize that the sea fates are sort of part of the argument, I guess, of campaign arcs in a lot of way. They're sort of the more like polemic aspect of the game. They are more this kind of sort of a little bit of an indulgence towards these ideas of what I kind of like described at least as ecosystem and of this kind of like narrative sort of format that campaign arcs is kind of building towards. I think also in a gameplay sense, players realize over the course of multiple campaigns that electing to become a sea fate in your last game is a real gamble if you know there are going to be other sea fates in the
Yes.
game. I think
Yes.
that's the biggest thing is that people will throw themselves into it being like, well, that's a 50% chance. If there's 3 sea fates in the game, I've got a 33% chance of winning that final game. And I think that that's like a one of those things that players almost need to like recontextualize and be like, well, if we're going into a game, a sort of an act 3 of our campaign where we have nothing but A fates, I can kind of win on the sort of merits of the game I've played beforehand.
Hmm.
Whereas throwing yourself into a C fate is a real like it's quite a risky maneuver, I think,
Yes.
especially if you're on your own. If it's just one C fate, the whole table is going to be like locked down with this common purpose of just stopping you from doing
Right.
anything. And it gets muddier the more of them there are in the game, I think. But then electing to become them is kind of you're at the whims of the whole table there. And I think that I
True.
touched on that in the review of this idea of like you want to be in a campaign, you want to be selectively fostering sea fates. You don't want a sort of reach in which people feel it's impossible for them to ever win points. You want everyone to feel close, but you've got the little ace up your sleeve that's gonna, tip you over
Sure.
the line.
Yeah.
um but I can definitely see people being frustrated with them. I
Hmm.
think they are a very it's a it's kind of classic leader design, I suppose. This like very
Sure.
strange little sting right at the end that's going to make people go like, "Excuse me."
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
And I can understand that for sure.
Yeah, I've come to this analogy. I think it's helpful. Is like if you played Root, you especially competitively, you know that the Vagabond is often seen as a higher tier faction, but if there's a
Mhm.
second Vagabond in the game, then it's a much different calculus how strong this Vagabond is because now you can't just sneak under the radar. Everyone's focusing on and talking about the Vagabonds. And
Yeah.
so imagine if when you're drafting, if you don't know if there's a second Vagabond in the game. So like that's you got to decide. Am I going to be this Vagabond?
Right.
That may not be my favorite. It's not really the best for the map. And there may be another Vagabond in the game. You know, like
Yeah.
it's much harder just to decide I'm going to do this. Um,
Hmm.
but sometimes you get lucky in that you have a really good C fate with where the board state is, and it just lines up for you. But even then, like with summits, like players can say, "No, we're not going to let you do this."
Yes, yeah. I think that's where, like, especially in your Act 3 of the campaign, is where the sort of player policing really comes in. And I
Hmm.
think that's something that, like, if you aren't used to that kind of, like, sort of I guess it's like entanglement and like sort of like meta talk about the sort of the way the game is going as a whole. That's when those C fates are really dangerous because I think you need a level of player collaboration to sort of stop them from just coming out of nowhere and sort of taking out your whole your nicely accumulated pile of points. I think that's where them being something that can just win on like any chapter really comes into play because they immediately feel like this constant threat. And I think that's sort of the game telling you, hey, like you need to sort of do something,
Right.
whether that be on your own or whether that be together to stop these fates from really running away with it. But I like how narratively urgent they feel. I think that's the sort of my takeaway from it
Hmm.
is that even though people can find them grating in terms of the design of it, like the stories that come out of them are just so exciting because
Hmm.
they are immediately so jeopardizing and sort of intense. Like when you learn that there's sort of a guy going around the galaxy, like putting people in bunkers and like sealing them away forever, you're like, we got to stop this freak. Like, come on. And the table kind of cornering around that, I think, is
Hmm.
really narratively compelling, even if some people might find it sort of like functionally or gameplay wise a little frustrating to deal with.
Sure. Okay. Well, let's pivot and talk about
Mm,
some strategies and
very
tactics.
good.
I
This
practiced.
guy's played some arcs.
Um, so what are some, I guess, strategies or tactics that you think or you want to just talk about or you think are pretty nifty or some people who are still curious about arcs or on the fence of arcs or people who are hardcore arcs? Like, yeah, I want to talk about this strategy or this tactic.
I guess on the back of what we were just talking about, one that I think was kind of funny that happened in one of my most recent games was someone had a huge lead on Warlord,
Mm-hmm.
and yet the table was kind of not paying attention to them enough. They were like, whatever, that guy's getting 9 points, and then he was gonna. I saw his 2 material, and he was parked on a planet with 2 empty slots. I knew he was gonna build those cities, and he was gonna score like what, like 14 points in one turn.
Mm-hmm.
So in that position, and people were kind of like dunking on me in that game, and I felt like I was behind on points. I was a little guy. I didn't want them to hurt me anymore. And so even though it was kind of crazy, I declared Warlord again, so that this guy who had tons of trophies was now going to get like 20 points if they let him score
Yep.
Warlord.
Yep.
And I think that that's such an interesting. Everyone was like, "You're an idiot. That's crazy." But I think that it's a really important thing to do sometimes to like snap people's focus that a particular player is running away with it. And the intention there was to say, this guy's going to get this many points. Let's take some of his ships as trophies
Right.
rather than him having all of ours in that little bucket. Let's
Mm-hmm.
sort of erode his board position rather than playing this little game where we were sort of fighting amongst ourselves.
Right.
Sometimes using ambitions kind of aggressively like that to say, hey, no, this is zero sum. You have to stop this guy or else,
Mm-hmm.
he's going to win. Is something you can do sort of within the game rather than just within the sort of chatter of it. Like I was saying to people before declaring, I was going, we need to do something about this. And they were like, whatever, whatever, whatever. And the only way to make them believe is to make them even more dangerous.
Yep. No, that's
um,
true.
Okay, I'm glad you say so because I thought like I was like I'm either a genius or I'm a complete idiot,
No.
sort of double declaring like that.
No,
But sometimes it's useful.
it is useful, and here's why. People are very instinctive, and so you
Mm.
may say one thing, but if they don't see it themselves, they may or may not agree with you. But if you can make it so obvious that no one can ignore it, it's like waving a
Yes.
red flag over a raging bull. Where it's like, yeah, like I thought we were here to win, right? And it's like, well, what are you doing? It's like, well, and so this is where you can preemptively do this by
Mm.
declaring something you have no chance of winning in chapter one or even chapter two, because those points aren't really what's going to win you the game. It's chapter three, chapter four. And so if you can start
Yes.
pinning the winner on someone else and you don't even try for those ambitions that you're declaring, it
Mm.
can help you in table talking and help you in board position because, oh, you're behind. Like, well, am
Yes.
I? Or am I just actually putting the focus on someone else just from the get go? Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
no, sure, free
No,
points are free points, so it's
absolutely.
dangerous, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I think so. I think it's that whole dance is really interesting. And I think there's also like in that sort of similar like sphere, because I think the thing that took me longest to kind of really like sink into in terms of like the strategy or tactics of arcs is that layer of table talk and of sort of like the sort of alliances and diplomacy that can happen. It's not as common as it might be in games like Oath, where it's kind of like hard coded into the
Right,
design, but
right.
there is definitely, quite a lot of it in arcs. Um, and on that topic, like having neighbors in the game that are going for different ambitions to you is like very, very useful. Like if you're sort of parked next to someone who's got like two cities on a relic planet, you're like, I know what they're up to. I'm not going to try and compete for them on that. I'm going to use my little snug sort of like corner of space where I am with them to launch out into doing something else is like very viable. You can have that kind of like understood alliance for as much of the game as you need to have it, and then you're in the perfect position to give them a little jab later down the
Mhm.
line.
Right.
Um, but I think that's like I was very like quickly in arcs like fighting my neighbors straight away, being like, I'm next to you, especially if you're playing like an aggressive leader like the Corsair or something, you're like, I'm right next to you, you're my nearest target, I have to spend the fewest pips of my aggression card to get into your territory, I'm just going to start fighting you.
Right.
When sometimes having a kind of like a little segment of the board that is kind of policed by you and one other player can actually be really beneficial. It's just then when the tide starts to turn, when they're getting a few too many points from those ambitions that you're letting them have, that's when things get ugly. But hey, you're in the right spot to give them a little bash. So
Mhm.
yeah, I think that's like something to not be afraid of in the game. Is that level of like that above that kind of table talk. It just takes a long time to get to that point because the game is so immediately like strange from the get go that I think players are uncomfortable getting like in our first few campaigns our summits were very unproductive
Sure.
because people didn't really know what they wanted because the game is so like strange
Mhm.
from turn one. But now we're how many campaigns in deep we're throwing away resources left, right, and center.
Yeah.
So I guess that would be sort of the big thing would be just talking about like that kind of stuff. I guess on top of that, like I in your sort of videos on resources
Oh, yeah,
and
yeah.
like there's a
Mhm.
lot of chats about like pairing resources together and I think that's super useful information like the psionic relic combo and having some like spare fuel and weapons to kind of juice some cards into being dangerous. I think that on top of that though, it's funny looking at how you can use resources and cards in concert, and the biggest one that came up so many times in one of my most recent games was people playing weapons on construction cards, and then having battles where they would like turn one, roll a fistful of assault dice, and then be like, "Oh, that's really bad. Repair, repair, repair," and then just be like, fine with it. Or they'd roll all their assault dice and then be like, "Oh, that went great. I'll roll another handful," and just going again.
Yep.
That stuff's always is really interesting. People realizing those little sort of strange. I think there's something about this is kind of slightly off topic, but something about arcs that I kind of really enjoy is that every like time I've played it, I feel really happy if I get to do like a couple of really cool things in a game,
Yeah.
or I do something that like people are like, oh, we've not seen that before, and that's cool. And I love that I'm this many games in, and I'm still having those experiences where I'm seeing these like, especially realizing, oh god, crazy, but like having these like turns where you think of turns in arcs as being a, a sort of a single hand.
Right.
You can sort of conceptualize them as we're going to play out a hand, and then there's almost like this soft reset in your brain, and then we play another, sorry, not a hand, a trick. We're going to play
Mm-hmm.
one trick, then we're
Right.
going to have this almost like soft mental reset, and then we're going to do another trick. Like, forget about what happened before. But people planning sort of glacially over multiple tricks and having these like clever little intricacies where they sort of set something up at the end of one and then, catch it in the next. I'm going to say it again. It's a good game. They made a good game. They
Right.
they did it.
Yeah. Yeah, I love arcs. It's I think
Really?
part
You?
yeah, I
I
do.
don't
I know it's crazy. But I think the skill ceiling and the strategy, the depths of how high you can go and how low you can go, and like it does let you fall on your face.
Yes.
So
Yes.
you can
Very
go
much so.
for these big plays, and there's like, yeah, you can abandon all your cities and starports to do this crazy raid,
Mm.
but now you're completely vulnerable if you don't win right now.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah. There's something that like a sort of a big like one of those kind of like shoot the moon moments in a recent game was someone using mining interest, the card that just lets you fill up on resources, using that to fill up on resources, but they had loyal empaths, so they could use all of them as psionics. And it was just like it just came out of nowhere.
yeah.
And they just spent like 5 psionics in one go, just being like, and I'm gonna influence, like, because I think they played it with a 2 of mobilization. And
Hmm.
so they were like, I'm going to influence 7 times or something ridiculous. Like, I'm going to influence 9 times on this turn. And it's like stuff like that that makes you really like, that just breaks your expectations of what you can do in a round. I think
Hmm.
that's the really exciting stuff that keeps me coming back, being like, God, I want to have one of those turns per game. I want to have one of those like crazy sort of like, what the heck? It's coming out of left field. Ugh.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on this debate that this came up as playtesting, but it's come up during the tournament as well. Was spreading your cities really quickly to get a bunch of bonus points versus just waiting and going for big raids at the end, or maybe a third different
Mm.
strategy. But have you tried either of those, or you think one's stronger than the other, or like just depends on the board state?
My housemate Luke, who I mentioned earlier, like it's funny because we're like very like diametrically opposed in terms of how we like to play the game.
Mm-hmm.
He's very much, I will not move out of my starting cluster. I'm gonna just like get a million guild cards, and then I'm
Mm-hmm.
gonna I'm gonna wait till chapter 4, and then I'm gonna spend them all in this like crazy flurry of like my turns are gonna go on for like an hour and a half, and you're gonna like sit there and watch.
Right.
Whereas I'm much more of the kind of like, and you're gonna do that, and I'm gonna hit you like a pinata and just steal your like your guild cards one by one. And the nice thing is that we've got about the same kind of win rate. Like neither strategy has been sort of more like potent than the other.
Mm-hmm.
But I will say that like a really like I think that something that's really funny about the game is that people will, when they're deciding when to move their ships, they'll be like, I better keep like one behind at my starport to stop someone from raiding me. And then like no one is gonna look at one ship and be like, oh,
No.
I'm not touching that. That's too scary. Um, so I'm definitely becoming more of a player who will just go out and like send my whole fleet somewhere. I think controlling gates is way
Sure.
more important than people think it is. Like
Mm-hmm.
initially, I was playing games where the whole sort of ring would just be completely absent of ships. And people would be like, I'm gonna just teleport from one place to another because no one's in my way. And now we're playing a lot more games where people are really fighting tooth and nail over those those tiny little
Right.
sections of the board.
One of my
Um,
favorite table talk things is convincing a player to catapult and leave it behind a ship in my gate so that other players can't
mm.
catapult into me.
Yes, yes, yes.
So,
That's good.
and it's like, oh yeah,
They're
yeah,
like a free defense for you, yeah.
yes. And so you have to be careful which gates you leave ships behind because you may end up protecting someone you don't mean to protect because other people can't police
Mm,
them now because you are blocking the gate.
yes.
So,
That's always so funny in terms of like the timing of a round as well, where it's like someone's like, "Please, can you get out the way?" And you're like, "I'm trying, but I'm last in turn order. Like you're gonna need to sort this out amongst yourselves."
mhm,
Yeah, I always find that kind of hysterical, where it's like I think that's when people asking what the sort of cards in arcs represent. It's that sort of like bureaucracy of it all, isn't it? It's like you're trying to have this kind of like communication across space, but
sure.
something's getting lost in the way, and you're like, "I can't budge. I'm sorry, I've parked my ships in the wrong section." Yeah, I definitely think that's like the thing that I'm harping on about it, but the thing that is keeping me coming back is just seeing those weird things in every game and having those new little revelations every time, and them creating these kind of interesting stories that we then end up talking about long after the game is finished. Like, I think going all the way back to talking about it as like a timeless game, it's like I have not had so many plays of a game where we have then sat and talked about the game we just played for like a whole hour,
Right.
because every chapter has presented, oh, you should have done this then because that was really exciting, or oh, if you'd have done this at this point, my whole game would have been ruined, but you didn't quite see it and I was lucky, and stuff like that.
Yeah.
um yeah, that's for sure what keeps me coming back to it. And the fact that you're making, you can make these videos that are like
Mm-hmm.
analyzing the state of play as it happens,
Mm-hmm.
and that's where it's at. I think for me, that's the excitement there.
I completely agree. It is like you can play a game and you have your perspective on what happened, but if you
Mm.
can watch it again and see the different paths you could have taken, like a Paul Atreides type figure, like I see many paths, um,
Yes.
and I chose the wrong one, you know.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but if I chose this other one, I think it could have been very different, and that's what I like with those videos is like you get to kind of walk through the course and see how much agency you did have. You just didn't realize it because you were just
Mm.
focused on this one particular thorn in your side and realizing that's not
Yes.
that big deal. So don't get lost in that. Keep the big picture. And if you can do that, you actually can sneak away wins and to the
Mm.
frustration of your arch enemies because like I had him. What's going on? It's like mm,
I'm definitely glad that in the games that we've played, you've like, reminded that we should always sort of play it out. Because I think we've had in the games that we've had, we've definitely had very dramatic comebacks.
right,
And I think that was like early on, I think I would be sort of in playing the game quite keen to concede in those moments and be like, oh, it's unrecoverable. But I think that's what's exciting is that, a lot of people see that as a flaw, that you can come back from that. They think that,
sure,
oh, well, your good play should be rewarded adequately. But like,
sure,
I think it's way more exciting to have that like, photo finish every single time. Or most times. I've definitely seen games where people have just gone bananas and really wiped the floor. But that normally happens in games where you have players of a lot of experience against people who haven't played much. That I've seen that a few times.
sure. No, that's fair. Um, any other strategies or tactics or things of that nature you wanted to talk about?
Captives are good. That's probably
Mm,
it. Everyone forgets about captives, and you can just get a little pile of them, and then no one can stop you.
it's
But
true.
I'll be in the comments of this video with any new tactics that I sort of come up with
Mm,
in the next few weeks. In my next few games, if I see something spicy, I'll be like,
ah,
aha.
yeah. Yeah, I think for me, the first time when I was early playing arcs, it finally clicked for me was I used material to build a starport, a fuel to move, and then a
Yes.
weapon to do this massive attack at the very end. It was like, okay. So there's a
Yeah.
lot more
Yeah.
agency here than I really realized when I was first playing arcs. And so I think like just
Yeah.
finding ways to take what you have and string it together, and looking at what is possible and what is my opponent trying to do. So if they're in the material planet, are they going for a tycoon, or are they just that's where they started? If they're moving to the relic
Mm-hmm.
planet, are they also going to go for a psionic planet? Like what's going on? Why are they doing what they're doing? And then can I influence
Yeah.
that with my card play or my table talk? Um, because like you be surprised, like you really can influence people by just saying, "Hey, I have an aggression card. Don't do that." Oh,
Mm.
okay. I mean, I may not play it face up, but I mean, I have an aggression card. So
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I think that's something that people are really nervous of doing initially because they don't know where the lines are for that stuff, but also because I think that like the more of the game I've played, the more I've realized that it's really rewarding to just like play, the sort of play on vibes, play on kind of like these sort of like rough ideas of what you think would be sort of good in a particular moment. Almost like to soft role play as your leader is always a good idea as well. To sort of be playing in like if I'm being dealt the Corsair, what should I be doing with my turns? Well, I should be a horrible, aggressive bastard from turn one. That's
sure.
like it's in my interest to do that. But I think that initially again, that trick taking is so strange for people who haven't, played a lot of games of it, that I think they're shy to do that. But the more you can break out of like having to worry about the specifics of the trick taking, the more you can sort of get into the sort of more heady, overarching tactics that the game presents. And
Hmm.
that's what's definitely rewarding to me. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, let's wrap up by talking about some wish list things that we would love to see in future
Yes.
Arc stuff. So, do you have any items that are near the top on your list of wish list things?
I think it's like it's tricky because I always feel like making suggestions in this kind of vein makes me always feel like I don't really understand anything about game design, and so I don't know how hard it would be to implement any of this.
Right, right.
Um, but and honestly, like I'll be happy with anything they add to the game. I'm so excited to see what they do with it. That's the sort of the big takeaway. It's just I think any direction by which it's expanded is going to be interesting at the very least. Um, I think maybe something that I'd be kind of interested in seeing is, and I think they might have talked about maybe doing something like this, or maybe that's just a rumor somewhere in the ether, but an idea of kind of having a little bit of the sort of spice of the campaign being present in the base game. And I think some of that might be that I think in four-player games especially, to me like four players is almost the weirdest count for arcs because it requires the most like table talk and negotiation and
Sure.
stuff above the table that isn't just the core of the card play and resources and things like that. So having some way of doing a little bit of formalized negotiation in the four-player game, or in any base game arcs, having a little bit of like hard fast summit light kind of negotiation, I think
Hmm.
would go a long way to get players into the mindset of, oh, this is a game where we can do a little bit of diplomacy on the side, and we're not just restricted to playing this very abstract trick taking game. I'd like to see that,
Hmm.
just to get people into the right mindset.
Sure.
Um, I guess also, uh, and I think this is when people sort of talk about arcs being too abstract or like too soulless and things like that. Often they're talking about the board, in that it is a very, sort of symmetrical almost.
Hmm.
Obviously, it's not the way the planets are laid out is
Sure.
very interesting, the way the setup cards work, but on first blush, for sure, it's this very like, sort of symmetrical, cold universe. And so I would like to see um not necessarily for me, but just sort of broadly, I think it'd be kind of fun to inject into the game sort of like the landmarks from Root to kind of give the
Yeah.
map a bit of geography and give
Hmm.
planets a little bit of personality outside of just being
Hmm.
psionics.
Some texture.
And I think, yeah, a little bit of texture. Not that it's needed in the
Sure.
format. It's more that I think that the game has so much room for a little micro expansion you could chuck in just to make the sort of narrative sing, more than it already does. I think that's
Hmm.
the way that, leader games tend to really flourish is, being able to explain what happened in the game's terms, but that coming out like a story, right? Oath is really good for that. Like all of Oath's terminology and its mechanics point to post game reports that just sound like a little narrative
Right.
rather than
Yeah.
a game report.
Yeah.
Um, so a little bit of that would be cool. Obviously, just more leaders, more lore, please.
Right.
They're great. But I want infinite of those because they're delightful. And I guess also like I would like to see leaders that it sounds really silly to think of it sort of this way round, but some fates, some leaders that have like some like components to their name,
Sure.
like some little chits and tokens. Not like firstly just because I think that's cool. Like it's one of my favorite things about the fates is that you get your little tiny bag of like what the hell are these things, and you add this like
That no
extra
one
thread.
knows.
Yeah, who knows? And then you read out your card, and everyone goes, "Excuse me, like what the hell?" First time someone played as Hegemon in my game, when they have those banners, they can like teleport between. So like the table was like, "What are you talking about? This is horrible!" Like, and you were like, "Welcome to my world." Oh, I love the Hegemon. It's made my favorite fate. Um,
It's a good one.
but it's just you're just so evil, and I think that's fantastic. Anything that gets people to play in that space, I think is just really funny to me. But yeah, I think that like seeing the base game have fates that are like a little bit more like cosmic encounter, not as
Sure.
crazy as
Hmm.
cosmic, because I think
Sure.
that the game is sharper than cosmic is, and it's working on uh very different axes. But having these kind of fates that or leaders that have more asymmetry, more sort of weird texture to them in the base game would be very interesting to me. Obviously, a lot of that is just happening in the campaign, and it's done really well in the
True.
campaign. I have no doubt they will come up with great new fates down the line sometime, somewhere. But obviously, like, not everyone has a whole weekend at their disposal to play through a whole campaign of Arcs.
No.
Um,
But you don't have to have a
yeah,
whole weekend. You can do it over a month, which is
that's
nice.
true. That's very true. You can. Although I guess what I really want, and actually if anyone from Leaders watching, I guess what I really
Mm.
want is an entire second copy of Arcs, please. Because the problem is that I want to play a campaign game, right? And then I pack it away and then I'm like, oh, I want to play a
Mm.
game of the base game.
Mm.
What am I gonna do? So I just want another full copy of Arcs. That's what I need.
Let's see.
That's my expansion that I desire.
Okay.
Uh,
That's great.
yeah, yeah.
Let's see.
Oh, and
Mm-hmm.
actually, one final thing on the wish list.
Mm.
This is actually a serious one. This isn't just another copy of Ark. So it would be funny if I just said, actually, I want a third copy. Um, the idea to me of having, I think that I don't want more resources in the sense that I don't want more resources in the game in addition to what's already there. But like, imagine having like a sort of like a little bit of like you can only have 5 resource types in any given game, but then there are a
Oh.
couple you can swap out.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like, what does a game of Arcs look like when there's no weapons, but instead you've got uranium, right? Or like, what does
Alternate weapons, alternate fuel, alternate
yeah, yeah, yeah,
material.
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I thought that like there's like and there's just fun words like imagine having intel. I don't know what it would do, but like
Mm-hmm. That's funny
sort
you
of
say
tactic
that.
on it to get some intel.
I have a similar wish list thing. So I guess
Yeah.
sort of
What are your wishes? What are your
for
wishes?
my wishes, I would say number one is an alternate action deck. So all
Oh.
like alternate construction or alternate aggression. And so like cuz you can look at
Yeah.
so there's 7 total actions and it's like 3 are unique and then 4 are pairs, but you can move them slightly around so that what if you can move and build on a card? What would that look like?
Ugh.
Yeah. And so like what if you could move in tax?
Yeah,
What
yeah.
would that look
Just
like?
shifting all the actions like
Mhm.
one to the left and just
Yeah.
having these cards that would be really fascinating.
And
That would be
then
that
if
would
you
be so
had that, then you could it's more easy to have campaign and base because you have 2 action decks you can alternate between.
right.
So I think
Ah.
that's something that is again, is it likely? Probably not because I don't know how feasible that is, but that's something I'm interested in. More setup cards. I think there's a lot of room for
Yes.
design on that. And I
Mm.
think just through the time, understandable, but I think there's a lot of room they could do a lot of really neat stuff with those setup cards.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and then I've
And they're always
mhm.
interesting because they're kind of almost like an invisible part of the design. I think people don't think about them that much, but like, you've done 3 videos on the things. Like there is a lot of texture to them that I
Yes.
think goes underappreciated. I think if Leader were like, "Oh, our new expansion for Arcs, it's got 10 new setup cards," people would be like, "Oh."
No, I would
But
be happy.
really,
I would
it
be
would
happy.
yeah, you would be the one guy like, "Woo!" But I think deep down, everyone would feel the change in a way that
Yes.
would be quite exciting. So,
Yeah,
yeah.
because even like with Root, like Root has 4 maps. When they added the 2 new ones, everyone's like super excited. Well, Arcs has 12. So like Arcs starts with 12. So there's a lot more they can do though.
Yeah.
And then there's one fate I really hope they do, and it's based off the movie A Total Recall, where this average Joe guy wants to go to Mars, and he ends up getting his memory recovered and realizes he's actually a secret agent. And his
Yes.
previous self sends him messages on what he should do to help the cause, but then halfway through the movie, he realizes that his past self was actually a bad guy, and his
Mm.
past self was manipulating him to infiltrate these terrorists who are actually good people, and so he doesn't want to go with it anymore. So he actually pivots
I'm so
away.
into it.
So
Yes.
so that would be the B fate. And so you have this trajectory where you're going to be secret agent, but then you're actually a bad guy in the C fate, but you can actually pivot to a different C fate. Um,
Oh, the idea, like, there's like something so salient there of like the idea that you fail your B fate and you never learn that you were the bad guy.
right.
Like you just don't even get to that stage because you didn't. Oh, that would be so good. I'm into it.
So
It's so
yeah,
like the thing that's so exciting about the potential for more campaign stuff is just that, like, because it's such a blank slate as far as like what sci-fi they are possible, what they are able to draw from in sci-fi. It's like that is just like so immediately exciting to me. Like looking at sort of sci-fi properties that like I'm like really into and being like, what would that look like when you transport it into arcs? And then
yeah,
it's not even like nothing in there is reductive like that. Everything that they've put into it so far is like an amalgamation of lots of different sort of sci-fi ideas. Like what does like Leader Games' spin on the Traveler in Destiny look like?
mm,
Right, I'd be the first person at the door. I'd be buying that day one. I mean, I'm buying it day one anyway, but I'd be even more excited. But anyway, yeah, they. I
hmm
think that just. I think that's what has excited me the most about the possibility for the game having such a like sort of nice and sort of straightforward core, especially in comparison to like Root. It has a sort of. I mean, actually, Root does have a lot of structure in it to be expanded, but
sure,
the way that Arcs has been sort of like built from the ground up almost, or it has this like very like simple skeletal core that they can just run away with.
yep,
So exciting, so exciting.
yep. And I think like an alternate um, court deck for the base game would be neat too.
Yes, yeah. I
Even
was thinking
some,
about what's that one? Root has one, like Exiles and Partisans,
yeah,
doesn't it?
even one where
And
it
that's
could be
just like
more
so cool.
modular too, where you could like you have
Yeah.
groups of five, so you could swap out like the silent cards for a different set of silent cards or something
Mm,
more modular. So you just need five
yeah.
of each type, and then six box cards. And then you have like a you can mix and match maybe. Um, I guess the last thing would just be similar to what you said, but like scenario play where you I wanted to play the campaign, but I just want to play one session. And
Yes.
so here's
Yeah.
here's a scenario you can play where here's a one session game or two session game. That
Mm. We
is
could like
just
lead into the campaign as well. That's
mm-hmm.
exciting too. Like
Yeah.
that, the idea of being able to prep people. I think that's the biggest thing. Is that it is quite a leap going from base game to campaign, but having some room to allow people to like experience some of those systems in a sort of smaller scale before then being like, now you're locked in for however many hours of campaign we're going to go through. Is I think
Yeah.
that'll be delightful. Um, yeah. Oh, I remembered another thing on my
Ooh,
wish list
okay.
actually. Yeah, I wanted to bring back the hex map. Actually, that's number one.
He's bringing back the hex, guys. Wow.
They gotta go. I only like the game when it was a hex map. I refuse to touch this thing now. Yeah, no, I don't want them to do that. But it would be really funny if they did.
Yeah. It yeah, the map. Yeah. Yeah, maybe we could just end talking about the map. So when I first saw the map, like the current final version, the first thing
Mhm.
that popped into my head was this looks just like Trivial Pursuit. What's going on? Like this is like what am I looking at? And I think a lot of people have that gut reaction of what? Like it's
Yes.
not intuitive at first because again, this is supposed to support play, not an aesthetic where it's pleasing to look.
Mm,
And I think it is fine to look at. I think like in person, especially than like a
mm,
online picture. In person, it
yeah.
actually looks very fine. Um, it is actually kind of striking with the name in the middle too, because like that's an older, you know, design principle.
Mm,
Put your name right in the
yes.
middle, and many successful games have done that. Like that's not unheard of to do that.
It's
Um,
just like Monopoly.
and Sorry, and plenty of other
Yeah.
games, and so I think it actually does work for arcs because it is like, what is that? Like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Um, and so I think once you play it, it actually makes a lot of sense why the map is the way it is,
Hmm.
because the whole point of arcs is there are no places to hide, there are no corners, and any
Mm,
hex map is gonna have a corner, even if you do fancy like Pac-Man looping stuff where there are no edges. Like it is that's harder to read than the current map state. Um,
yes.
so I think once I played it one time, it clicked for me. But I think other people may take a couple of times for them to click on the map.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
for some people, they value the aesthetic more than I do, and that I think that's fine. I think, but it is funny though looking at the previous iterations of the map. And also just watching the design diaries of Cole explaining how he made the app very haphazardly and seeing people like try to stand for the map and defend the map like this is integral part, knowing that there are design diaries where he's just showing, I just put it together in like 15 minutes. It's like, Like, but again, like I think again, presentation matters. Like how you present yourself and present your
Yes.
product matters. And when you do Kickstarter, the way that it goes these days is this is very professional. This is almost final, even if that's not what
Yeah.
Leader
Yeah.
does. That's how a lot of
No,
people took
true.
it.
Yeah, I think that the good thing about the current map, and I think they would have a lot of trouble if it was still a hex map and the game still played like it does today, right? I think they would have more trouble with that initial expectations versus what the game actually is. And I think the current map in its iteration, even though some people might, dislike it for various reasons, I think it looks fab. I had the privilege of basically not paying attention to the game at all during development. I just saw it went up on Kickstarter and went, cool. I'm not going to think about it, otherwise I will go crazy.
Sure.
And then the game just arrived one day, and I was like, great. But the map as it is now, I think fits the game that Arcs is on a sort of like broader level way more than a hex map would. And I think if people saw the hex map, they would go into it thinking typical space game. I'm going to build up a big fleet and I'm going to charge it into someone and I'm going to research technologies and yada yada yada, and not be presented with what Arcs. Or they would be shocked when they then play what Arcs actually is, this very opportunistic kind of like close quarters combat, quite brutal game that doesn't have that sort of like slow build to power like other space games do.
Hmm.
I think that it's all about like with this game and with any, but like setting expectations is so important as to how people engage with it on their first play. And I think that having the map look like this is at least going to brace people and going, this is a little weird. And then hopefully they will engage with it
Right.
as a weird thing rather than as the typical thing they might be
Sure.
used to.
Yeah, because Arcs doesn't have exploration. It really doesn't have the traditional space type of colonization either.
Yeah,
Even like the cities you're building, like it's not the traditional sense of a typical sci-fi 4X city
sure.
generally.
Yeah,
So,
yeah, yeah.
because there are a lot of more consequences for destroying a city in Arcs than most
It's
space
true.
4X games. So I think it is effective for what it does because in a four-player game, especially with one cluster removed, like we're pretty much on top of each other. There is no
Yes.
my space where here's my slice. Like what
Mhm.
slice? We're all in each other's
Yeah.
slice. Like you can try to do that, but that's not what Arcs generally is most of the time. So I think the map
Yes.
helps make that more clear. Um,
Yeah. No, for sure, for sure.
all right, Tom. Well, thank you for your time, and hope you have many more Arcs games in your future.
Thank you. I'm sure I will. It's actually become a real problem. Like I have a huge amount of other games that I need to play for work, but every week they're like, "On my board game night, the people want arcs. The people want arcs, and I have to give it to them as the only person in my group who has a copy." So, sorry if you were expecting to hear about other games from ShutUpAndSitDown.com, but it's like Arcs month for the next 3 months, I think. Uh,
All right. Well, hope you have a
yeah.
good
Lovely to
day.
chat.
All right. Bye
Bye.
bye.